Celtic in Person, Volume 2, Willie Orr, Part 3, 1904 to 1906. Celtic's win in the 1904 Scottish Cup final marked a seismic change in the struggle between Celtic and Rangers for dominance in Scottish football. Rangers had won 4 league championships in a row between 1898-99 and 1901-02, and while neither had won the league in the 2 seasons since, Rangers had won the Scottish Cup in 1903, and the two clubs now had 4 wins each in Scotland's Premier competition and 4 outright wins each in the Scottish League. Rangers had shared the very first league championship with Dumbarton in 1891, but at the time there was no claim that they had won the title 5 times. The story of season 1903-04 wasn't quite finished though. There was a nasty postscript to the Scottish Cup final when the teams met in the final of the Glasgow Charity Cup on the 14th of May 1904, and Celtic's Scottish Cup final hat-trick hero Jimmy Quinn was injured in a shocking challenge from Rangers fullback Nick Smith, one of their veteran defenders who had been badly exposed by Quinn at Hampden. The collision occurred after just 3 minutes, and Celtic, playing with 10 men for 87 minutes, lost a bad-tempered match 5-2. There was a definite feeling that Quinn had been deliberately crocked by the Rangers player, who had, coincidentally enough, been responsible for Jack Bell limping uselessly along the wing in the 1899 Scottish Cup final. Quinn spent the rest of the summer on crutches. Tragically, just 8 months later, Nick Smith was dead after contracting enteric fever, only a few days after his wife died of the same illness, leaving behind 4 young children. He was only 31 years old. Nicol Smith was not the last Scottish footballer to die too young that winter, and the next, when it came, would hit Celtic a lot closer to home. Just days before the Charity Cup final, the face of Celtic Park was changed forever by the fire that swept through the grandstand on the Janefield Street side of the ground on the evening of 9th of May 1904. Had the fire broken out only a few hours earlier, there would have been a significant number of spectators in both the stand and the enclosure below for the Charity Cup semi-final between Celtic and Queen's Park, and a real tragedy might have unfolded. As it was, the fire brigade were alerted to the blaze at around 10:30pm, and within 2 hours the stand had been destroyed, along with the upper storey of the Pavilion. The Dundee Evening Telegraph of the 10th of May 1904 reported, "The grandstand and pavilion at the grounds of the Celtic Football Club Glasgow were completely destroyed by fire last night. The Central and Eastern Divisions, under Firemaster Patterson, were turned out, and on their arrival in the narrow roadway between the football ground and Janefield Cemetery, the firemen found that the stand itself was a mass of flames, and that there was little or no hope of saving the pavilion. The fire had originated near the east end of the stand, and, fanned by a slight westerly wind, the flames were blown westwards with a terrible rapidity. In an incredibly short time, they worked their way through the open woodwork with a loud and ominous crackling, which could be heard at a considerable distance. The wind carried the sparks in the direction of the Grant stand, and at one time there was serious danger of it also becoming ignited. Fortunately, the breeze was not of sufficient strength to carry the embers such a distance, but the scorched and blackened grass bore testimony to the danger in which this erection was placed. At one juncture, the fire presented a brilliant spectacle. Before the police arrangements had been thoroughly perfected, the crowd in Janefield Street was very dense, and numbers had climbed upon the wall of the cemetery. When at its height, the fire shed a brilliant reflection on the sky which was seen for miles around. As far away as Coatbridge, the semicircular glow showed clear above the horizon. From the other side of the park, the spectacle was a fine one, the whole erection with the woodwork of the terracing and the roof all ablaze, the iron struts and girders standing out against the bright background, parts of the corrugated iron roof falling in large sheets into the burning basement of the structure and throwing up great showers of sparks and flames. About half an hour after the brigade arrived, the large flagstaff, which stood above the centre of the stand, fell outwards into the street, carrying with it a portion of the structure. The fire at this time had spread to the west end of the grandstand, and soon the pavilion also was in flames. This building, being like the stand principally constructed of wood and of light and inflammable material, burned rapidly. the upper storey was completely destroyed, and although one or two of the rooms in the ground flat were not burned out, the building was totally wrecked. By midnight, the flames had pretty well spent themselves. All the corrugated iron of the roof had fallen in great twisted masses among the burned and ruined terracing, and the beams and girders lay bent among the other debris, the whole presenting a picturesque sight. The grandstand, which was on the north side of the field, was about 110 yards in length and 30 yards in breadth. It was constructed after the usual pattern of such erections, with terraced seats rising backwards from the cycling track to the outside of the ground to a height of about 50 feet. It provided sitting accommodation for 3,500 spectators and had a corrugated iron roof supported on steel struts and girders. The pavilion, which stood a little to the northwest of the stand, was a comparatively small building, being only about 40 feet by 30 feet and 2 storeys in height. It included the rooms of the club, a billiard room in which was a table which cost £75, retiring rooms for the players, bathrooms and other apartments. In the pavilion was a large quantity of what in football parlance is described as stock, consisting of players' clothing, hurdles and other athletic apparatus, and seats for the track to the value of about £500. When erected about 10 years ago, the stand and pavilion cost about £6,000. The erections, however, have from time to time been strengthened and improved to meet the requirements of the Dean of Guild Court. So recently as the international football match, which was played on the 9th of last month, the stand was completely renovated, and having been officially inspected by the Master of Works, the linens of the court declared it to be safe and sound in every respect. The erections destroyed were insured to the extent of only about £2,000, and there was no insurance on the content of the pavilion. The loss to the club will therefore amount to fully £4,000. The stand which has been destroyed, it should be understood, is the Grand or North Stand, not the Grant Stand, which is on the opposite side of the field. Notwithstanding the destruction of the stand, the match between the Hibernians and the Celtic will be played tonight, according to arrangement. The pavilion in the end was salvaged, but most of Celtic's official club records to that point were destroyed, and the grandstand was never rebuilt, becoming instead the covered enclosure that would come to be known as the Jungle. The destruction of the stand was also responsible for the reorientation of Celtic Park, with the club offices and changing rooms eventually becoming located on the London Road side of the ground rather than the original Janefield Street. In the aftermath of the fire, the club purchased the Grant Stand from director James Grant. The week after the Scottish Cup final, 23rd of April 1904, Willie Maley left Celtic in the hands of James Kelly for their final league match, a 6-1 victory over Kilmarnock, with an on-fire, no pun intended, Jimmy Quinn, hitting 5 goals. Maley had gone to the FA Cup final at the Crystal Palace in London to see Manchester City defeat Bolton Wanderers 1-0 in front of 61,000 spectators. His older brother Tom Maley had remained involved at Celtic since his playing days ended a decade before, but had taken over as manager of 2nd Division City in 1902. He guided them to promotion in his first season in charge and was now an FA Cup winner, making the Maleys the only brothers to manage Scottish and FA Cup winners in the same season. Sadly, Tom's time in charge at City ended in controversy a year later, when City lost out on the Division 1 Championship in the final match, going down 3-1 to Aston Villa. A punch-up ensued after the match between City's Sandy Turnbull and Villa's Alex Leake. Leake alleged afterwards that City captain Billy Meredith had offered him £10 to throw the match, and in the investigation that followed, feeling he had been hung out to dry by City, Meredith blew the lid on City paying players more than the permitted £4 per week. It was an open secret that this was widespread in the game, but Tom Maley was made an example of by the FA and was banned sine die from English football, although this was later lifted and he became manager of Bradford Park Avenue in 1911 and promptly changed their red, black and gold strip to green and white hoops, which they wore for the next 14 years. Under Maley, they won promotion to the First Division. A report in the Scottish Referee of the 8th of August 1904 makes for interesting reading. Quoting from the Manchester umpire, the paper reports Tom Maley calling for an end to the £4 maximum weekly wage, which he believed would lead to fewer players actually being paid as much as £4 per week. In support, he references Scotland, where there was no maximum wage, yet Celtic's yearly wage bill was £1,000 less than Manchester City's. In the close season of 1904, meanwhile, Celtic embarked on a tour of what was then Austria-Hungary, playing matches in Vienna and Prague. It's thought Johnny Madden played for Slavia Prague against Celtic before becoming their manager the following year. Rangers also toured the country that summer, and the Scottish referee of the 30th of May 1904 reported on the impressions the clubs made in Vienna, which gives rise to a suspicion that it may have been their own impression rather than that of the Austrians. The Vienna Times of last Tuesday has been sent to us, and the special translator of foreign languages on our staff quotes several passages from the sporting column to let readers of the referee know how the Celts and Rangers appeared to the Austrians. The general introduction is as follows. We have now seen the Scottish professionals, and moreover in a double supply. The Rangers pleased us better. They are a finer body of men than the Celtics. Their play is more intelligent, and they scorn certain tactics of their fellow countrymen. Of course, a struggle between the two clubs would naturally be very close, for the Celtic make up in weight for what they lack in other respects. On the whole, however, we have not learned much that is new from the Scottish professionals. In the summer of 1904, it had been 6 years since Celtic had last won the Scottish League, although having won 3 Scottish Cups and 5 final appearances since then had kept them very much at the forefront of Scottish football. But since that last title win in 1897-98, they had lost their previous consistency. Now Willie Maley had assembled a team laced with the hardness and determination needed to complement an exhilarating forward line. Scottish Cup final hero Bobby Muir left for Notts County at the end of April 1904, and a few weeks later Maley signed a forward from Stenhousemuir who would become one of Celtic's greatest ever defenders, Alec Mcnair. The 20-year-old scored a double on his debut on the 17th of August 1904 in a benefit match for his former teammate James McBride, playing at inside left on the night. He would play a small but crucial part in the season ahead. Shortly before the start of the new season, the old warhorse Barney Battles was sold to Kilmarnock, and with him, the last playing link to the original Celtic team was gone. The last Celt to have played alongside James Kelly, Battles was still 6 months short of his 30th birthday, but had lost his place in the team when Willie Orr was moved to fullback to enable the creation of the half-back line of Young, Loney and Hay. Orr was now 31 years old, and apart from Peter Summers, who made a handful of appearances in season 1897-98, the last of the 19th century Celts. He was now the club captain and the only player in the squad in possession of a league winner's medal. In a team of talented but inexperienced players, Orr was the old head, whose vast experience would prove vital in the season to come. The first home game of the season, a couple of days after the league campaign was opened against Partick Thistle at Meadowside, was a benefit match for Willie Orr, an understrength Celtic drawing 0-0 with Queen's Park. The season opened on the 20th of August with a 5-0 win over Partick Thistle, with Alec Bennett back in the centre as Jimmy Quinn continued his recovery from Nick Smith's horror tackle in the Charity Cup final. The 10,000-strong crowd saw Willie Orr miss a first-minute penalty, even after being given a second attempt, but a dazzling performance saw them 3-0 up by half-time as they served notice of their intent for the season. The Scottish referee reported on the 22nd of August 1904, "Celts have got a grand young team together, most of them with reputations still to make, and judging by their display on Saturday, they intend to make them." Jimmy Quinn marked his return to action the following week, scoring a hat-trick and a 4-1 win away to Port Glasgow Athletic, before a Celtic Park draw against Hearts saw the first drop point of the season. They would beat Celtic 2-0 at Tynecastle a couple of weeks later in the return league match. Those were the only points dropped in the early part of the season, and by the day of the Glasgow Cup final against Rangers on the 8th of October, Celtic were second in the league, 2 points behind Ergionians with 11 points from 7 matches. Rangers had strengthened during the close season, signing left-half John May from Derby County and the prolific former Queen's Park and Scotland forward R.S. McCall from Newcastle United. They had been labelled as the Team of the Year in the newspapers at the start of the season, but as the match began, they were visibly wary of the threat posed by Jimmy Quinn. Athletic News writing on the 10th of October 1904, "The forwards, while not a brilliant company, did all that was required of them, the wings making all possible profit out of the attention devoted by the Rangers defenders to Quinn." New Hampden again provided a magnificent backdrop for the occasion, as over 50,000 spectators gathered for the first cup final of the season. Rangers started brightly and took an early lead through RC Hamilton after only 5 minutes, but from there they fell away as the strong, energetic Celtic half-back line of Young, Loney and Hay took command. The three swarmed all over the Rangers forwards, harrying and chasing them to distraction. Their normal, studied, regimented game came apart under the relentless pressure as Young and Hay kept a steady supply of passes to Bennett and Hamilton on the wings. The Dundee Evening Post reported on the 10th of October 1904, "The Celts trio never knew when they were beaten, for their covering up was so perfect that it was seldom that any liberty to break away was offered their opponents, while the Rangers lacked both head and determination in combating the cleverly designed passes of the Celts' front rank." Sonny Jim Young in particular stamped his authority all over the match, his robust tackling, energetic forward bursts and accurate passing being instrumental in the win. Named somewhat ironically after the perpetually smiling cartoon character used to promote a brand of American breakfast cereal, Young wore a constant dour, taciturn look on the pitch, with a playing style that combined the combativeness and all-action running of Roy Aitken and the metronomic passing of Bobby Murdoch. The Scottish referee of the 10th of October 1904 remarked on his noteworthy performance, but were a little sniffy about his physical work. "Young was the most useful, if not the most classic half on the field. His agility, energy and great reach made him the right man in the right place. His vigour occasionally was to the blameworthy side. His play would be none the worse of toning down, and would not be any less effective." Rangers held out until Celtic scored a deserved equaliser shortly before half-time. And although Jimmy Quinn is generally credited with the goal, Alec Bennett may have supplied the final touch. The Scotsman reporting on the 10th of October 1904, "Nothing daunted by their early reverse, the Celtic responded in the gamest fashion, and subsequent play pointed to their equalising, which they eventually did through Quinn, Bennett also being in at the finish." The Dundee Evening Post reported that this knocked the stuffing out of Rangers. "There was no resisting the rushes of the Celts, and ere the interval, through an error by Smith, the Celts equalised, and from then on, the Rangers were a beaten team." Celtic took the lead early in the second half, when Alec Bennett scored from the rebound after Jimmy Hay crashed a long-range effort off the crossbar. Rangers barely threatened thereafter, apart from one opportunity for R.S. McCall, saved brilliantly by Davy Adams. It was an unexpected victory for Celtic, and there was a sense of shock in the Scottish referee that the new-look Rangers were so comprehensively beaten, which is hard to comprehend given Celtic's even more emphatic Scottish Cup victory earlier in the year. Both defence and in attack, the Celts were sound, and they moved with an earnestness, power and combination far superior to the Rangers. What gives significance to Celts' Cup triumph, and must increase their pride and pleasure in it, is the fact that it was achieved by a team which, in comparison with Rangers, has cost the Directorate shillings instead of pounds. To Rangers, in addition to the loss of the Cup and loss of prestige, this consideration of cost must add to their chagrin. Fancy, stars of the magnitude of a Robertson, a May, a McCall and a Hamilton, beaten by a team composed of a MacLeod, a McMenemy, a Hamilton, a Bennett and a Quinn. Celts serve up here a lesson to all Scottish club officials, and one they would do well to lay heart to. Rangers are, of course, to be sympathised with, for it must be very disheartening to them to lose with a team of such talent, and one which has cost them so much money. On their class and on their form hitherto, the Light Blues were adjudged and regarded as the team of the year. But after Saturday's display, the verdict must be something very different. For the rest of the decade, there would be no surprise about any team in the United Kingdom being beaten by a McLeod, a McMenemy, a Hamilton, a Bennett and a Quinn. The following week, the two teams played out a much closer match at Celtic Park, with Celtic twice coming from behind with goals from Jimmy McMenemy and Alec Bennett to secure a 2-2 draw, leaving them tied on 12 points, although Rangers had played a game more, 4 points behind leaders Airdrieonians, who had also played a game more than Celtic. Over the next couple of months, the Glasgow pair overhauled Airdrie, with Celtic in particular showing great consistency, remaining unbeaten until the end of the year. On the 31st of December 1904, Celtic defeated Kilmarnock 3-1 in what would prove to be the final Celtic Park appearance of Barney Battles, who gave away the penalty dispatched by Willie Orr for Celtic's opener. The other two were scored by Alec Bennett and Henry McIlvenny, given a rare opportunity due to Jimmy Quinn having influenza. The win left Celtic on 31 points from 19 matches, 4 ahead of Rangers on 27 from 18 matches. The Scottish referee wrote on the day of Celtic's visit to Ibrox on the 2nd of January 1905, "If Celts win or even draw, they will undoubtedly improve their position, so much so that by doing either, the league banner will practically be theirs. The element of glorious uncertainty which invests this match today is just the element, especially on a New Year's Day, the public delight to have to give relish and enjoyment to their happy new year. As to the teams, the Rangers' experience at Airdrie is likely to lead to a change at half-back and forward." The Celtic team was barely recognisable on the day, with Willie Orr missing and Jimmy Hay at left-back, while Alec Mcnair took his place at left-half. In the forward line, there was no Jimmy McMenemy or Jimmy Quinn. Despite these notable absentees, Celtic held their own, although it was apparent long before half-time that the game was in danger of not being completed, with the crowd encroaching onto the pitch from the early minutes. The Dundee Courier wrote on the 3rd of January 1905, "It transpired that the turnstiles had been closed and the exit gates thrown open shortly after the start of the game. Matters were quickly developing into a farce, the crowd after the interval being fully 15 feet over the touchline of the north-east corner. Up till the interval, the game was really a burlesque, and it was practically certain that the match would be considered a friendly. Half-time, no scoring." Such was the overcrowding that the teams could not access the Pavilion at half-time, so after a few minutes to catch their breath, the players crossed straight over and began the second half. The Dundee Courier continued, "The spectators encroached more and more, and after 22 minutes play in the second half, referee Lewis declared the game abandoned. There was no scoring." At the conclusion of the match, it transpired that over 40,000 people had paid at the turnstiles. At this point, however, the pressure on the entrances was so great that the crowd, in their eagerness to gain admission, attacked the exit gates and broke them down. By this means, some 15,000 or 20,000 must have entered the ground. It is calculated that the attendance would total about 60,000. The game will, of course, be replayed. The policemen were powerless to drive the people back, but a free fight round the touchline broke the crowd into sections, and when another halt was called, this time for 3 minutes, 2 free kicks against the Celtic led to the crowd getting right in front of Adams, who could have done nothing had the ball come in from the right. The game was stopped 23 minutes from the finish, the crowd having become perfectly unmanageable, and when the teams left the field, the scene on the ground and around the Pavilion baffles description. Celtic were back in action at home to Airdrieonians the following day, and with a 3-2 defeat, their advantage over Rangers was now a precarious one. Airdrie had fallen away from the top of the league with a run of 6 successive defeats, but had now drawn with Rangers and beaten Celtic in successive games. The Airdrie defeat meant Rangers could draw level with Celtic if they won their game in hand, but Celtic's title hopes suffered a huge blow on the 14th of January, a 2-1 defeat against Dundee at Dens Park, leaving them only 2 points ahead of Rangers, who now had 2 games in hand. The match was refereed by Mr F. Kirkham of Preston, an English referee whom Celtic would see again a couple of months later. Celtic stabilised with victories at home against Hibernian and Morton, but before their next match, the Scottish Cup first-round tie against Lochelie United, the club was rocked by news of the death of Barney Battles on the 9th of February 1905. Battles had been suffering from influenza for the past 2 weeks, and while he had attended Kilmarnock's Scottish Cup tie against Beath on the 4th of February, had not been well enough to play. No one, though, expected anything other than a full recovery, but it is thought his illness developed into pneumonia and he died at home that morning. The Glasgow Observer wrote the following week, "A great sensation in footballing circles in Scotland was caused on Friday of last week by the startling announcement of the death of Barney Battles, the famous footballer. Battles, whose greatest games were played for the Glasgow Celtic, was this season in the ranks of Kilmarnock. For a fortnight prior to his death, he had been unable to play owing to an attack of influenza, but no one suspected that the stalwart physique would succumb to the attack. He passed away on Thursday night at his home in London Road, Glasgow. Deceased, who was 32 years of age, leaves a widow and 2 children, as well as his aged parents who reside in Bathgate, to mourn his loss. Battles came to the club from the heart of Midlothian, but his connection with the Parkhead club ceased for a while after the famous strike, after he and 2 other players refused to play on account of what they considered unfair comment in a Glasgow evening newspaper. Returning to the ranks of the Celtic, he blossomed out as one of the finest fullbacks in the country and figured in several international contests, and in a match v England at the Crystal Palace in 1901, he played the greatest match of his career. Although playing for Kilmarnock this season, Battles continued to take an interest in the Celts and was a great favourite with that club's supporters. During his brief illness, he was attended by Dr. Scanlon and received the consolations of the church from the clergy. The funeral, which took place to Dalbeth Cemetery on Sunday, was witnessed by 40,000 spectators who lined the route along London Road to the cemetery gate. 2,000 walked in the funeral procession, which included representatives from Queen's Park, Rangers, Celtic, Kilmarnock, Partick Thistle, Third Lanark, Clyde and other clubs. The coffin was borne from the chapel gate by his former club mates D. Doyle, John Campbell, Alec Mcnair and W. Orr. The Reverend Father Dugan, Sacred Heart, officiated at the cemetery. Barney Battles' date of birth is listed on his Celtic Wiki entry as the 13th of January 1875, so he may have only been just 30 years old when he died. As well as leaving behind a wife and 2 children, his wife was also pregnant with a son, named after his father, who went on to play as a forward for Hearts in Scotland. Coming less than a month after the death of Nicol Smith, the winter of 1905 was a desperately sad time for Scottish football. The flags at Celtic Park and Rugby Park were flown at half-mast on the 11th of February, and a week later, when the match abandoned on New Year's Day was replayed at Ibrox, both clubs would have cause to feel a keen sense of grief and loss on the occasion of a fixture the two had played such major parts in over the previous decade. The day before the match, the Scottish referee published on the 17th of February 1905 a poem attributed simply to a Celtic player. Brave Battles, brilliant in the football field, best of defenders of the threatened goal, strong in attack and steadfast in control, when greatest pressed, the least inclined to yield. He, brave and chivalrous, was a generous soul, whose strength with kindness happily was blent. He sought fair victory, not by might misspent, to keep intact his honour and his goal. Now death has smote him in its fell descent, and the spectators, struck dumb with surprise, stand still with awe when told, no more he'll rise. In one brief moment all his might is spent, and on yon green knoll, under spring's soft skies, in grief we stand, hearts bowed, heads bent. On the front page that day, the Scottish referee also saw fit to publish a cartoon depicting St Mungo, flanked by a Celtic and Rangers player, with the caption, "Go in and win, my children, the flag will not go out of the family whatever happens." While the Rangers player was quite normal looking, that of the Celtic player played up to the very worst anti-Irish caricatures of the day and leaves little doubt as to the artist's sympathies, while also providing a jarring contrast to the tone of respectfulness at the passing of Barney Battles. The 18th of February 1905 was one of the most important days in Celtic's history. It had been a long time since they had last won the league, and it was now do or die. Win and the title was still in the balance. Fail to win, and it was all but gone. What followed was one of Celtic's best ever wins at Ibrox, with a near-perfect performance in horrendous weather conditions that swept Rangers aside. The Edinburgh Evening News reported on the 20th of February 1905, "Then on Saturday, the Rangers have not been seen so much below par for many a day, and what was looked forward to as one of the matches of the season turned out to be distinctly disappointing. It was, however, perhaps the brilliance of the Celtic that went to accentuate the indifferent appearance of the Ibrox side, and one could well have imagined, at one period of the game at least, that it was some bottom leaguer struggling in the grip of the powerful Parkhead side." The platform for the win was provided by the defence, with Davy Adams having shaken off the jitters that had gifted Rangers the lead in the previous season's Scottish Cup final, developing into a top-class keeper. In front of him, Donny McLeod and Willie Orr adapted quickly to the wind and rain driving into their faces in the first half to snuff out the threat of the Rangers forwards. The Edinburgh Evening News continued, "Adams has been mentioned in these columns as a man with a safe pair of hands, and that description exactly fitted him on Saturday. He was never in a difficulty, and the manner of his saving seemed almost to take the heart out of the Rangers forwards. He could not have wished two better men in front of him than McLeod and Orr, whose work against the gale was well nigh perfect, and although the former made a bad slip in the last half, it came rather from the knowledge that the opposing force was almost impotent, and that a liberty or two could then be taken with impunity." The awful weather was responsible for the low attendance of only 28,000, the Scottish referee reporting on the 20th of February 1905. "It was pitiful to see the great majority of the crowd at Ibrox retreating at the double quick from the sweltering rain, which in torrents poured upon the crowd. Ibrox, we should say, created one record, that being in the time taken to clear the enclosure of its deluged occupants." Rangers attempted to play a close passing game, criticised in the newspapers as too intricate and unsuited to the conditions, while Celtic, even against the wind, played a far more expansive, energetic game and completely knocked them out of their stride. Sonny Jim Young was missing through injury, and Alec Mcnair came in at right half, impressing most observers in very difficult conditions. The Scottish referee wrote, "There was not a laggard in the Celts team, even the newcomer McNair bearing his share honourably in what was indeed a test of tests for youths and veterans. All Celts, youths and veterans, stood them like men. But alas, the same cannot be said for Rangers, for in both they had conspicuous failures." Celtic deservedly took the lead through Jimmy Quinn on 38 minutes, but Archie Kyle equalised for Rangers 3 minutes later to send the teams in level at half-time. In the second half, with the win now behind them, Quinn added a second on the hour mark before Davy Hamilton scored two quick goals in the 70th and 75th minutes. With the game already well beyond them, Rangers lost the services of R.S. McCall to injury, with the Scottish referee writing Celtic could easily have scored 6 in the end. The match was another triumph for Jimmy Quinn, whose rampaging performance on a quagmire of a pitch was once again too much for the Rangers defence to handle. He was rewarded the following day when he was named in the Scotland team for the first time for the forthcoming match against Wales. While praising his performance, there was notably a word of warning for Quinn in the Scottish referee. "Quinn goes sailing in for his first cap unanimously, and if he plays for his country as he does for his club, then he will be one of the best who has ever filled this most responsible position. He must curb his temper, however, for in a national there will be less warnings from the referee than he had at Ibrox." The win saw Celtic on to 39 points with one match to go, while Rangers were on 35 points and 3 games to play, 2 against Morton and 1 against Port Glasgow Athletic, meaning they could both finish on 41 points. Celtic, with the same 11 that won at Ibrox, reached 41 points with a 6-2 win over Motherwell at Fir Park on the 4th of March 1905, Jimmy Quinn scoring a hat-trick, the other goals coming from Willie Loney, Peter Summers and Alec Mcnair. With Rangers winning their 3 league matches, they duly joined Celtic on 41 points. But as in the very first season of Scottish League football, the rules stipulated a play-off was required to determine the winners. It was rather fortunate for Celtic that this was the case. Rangers had a superior goal difference and a superior goal average, so if either of those had been in use at the time, they would have been champions. These things even themselves out over the course of the seasons, of course. In 1891, Rangers had managed to share the title with Dumbarton despite having an inferior goal average and goal difference. In 1952-53, Rangers won the title from Hibernian on goal average, while if goal difference had been in use, Hibernian would have won it. Before the playoff match at Hampden on the 5th of May 1905, there was time for one more major controversy that season when the two clubs were drawn in the Scottish Cup semi-finals at Celtic Park on the 25th of March. The match itself was a disappointment for Celtic, who dominated the opening stages but had one of those days when they did everything but put the ball in the back of the net. Rangers steadied themselves as half-time approached, and then fullback Donny McLeod had to go off injured with the match still scoreless, leaving Celtic with 10 men for the entire second half. Rangers took advantage and were leading 2-0 when the flashpoint occurred about 10 minutes from the end. Jimmy Quinn, rightly or wrongly, was perceived to have a problem controlling his temper on occasion, and following a clash with Rangers fullback Alex Craig, the referee sent him off for allegedly kicking the grounded Rangers player. The Scottish referee described the incident in its report on the 27th of March 1905. A hard ding-dong match was completely spoiled by the most regrettable action of Quinn in regard to Craig. While on the ground, the latter was rushed on by the Celt centre and, apparently, when trying to save himself from Quinn's boot, he held him by the leg. Quinn tried to pull himself free, but Craig still clung to the leg. Then the Celt lifted his free foot and dealt the Ranger a vicious kick. Referee Robertson at once ordered Quinn off the field, and the crowd, resenting the decision, scaled the railing and invaded the field. The referee and several of the Rangers players were assaulted, the ball was stolen, and corner flags taken away. Amid chaotic scenes, the players were rushed to the Pavilion as hundreds of fans, mostly teenagers, cavorted on the pitch. Although the referee and possibly a couple of Rangers players were struck by pitch invaders, the vast majority appeared to have nothing on their minds other than stopping the match. After police restored order, the players were brought back out to complete the final 9 minutes, but almost immediately the pitch invasion was repeated and the Celtic directors intimated that they would forfeit the match. The incidents arising out of the match were dealt with at a specially convened meeting of the SFA Disciplinary Committee on the following Wednesday, at which Rangers claimed the tie should be awarded to them. Celtic stated they had already conceded the match on the day and had not changed their minds, so this was agreed without any further discussion or vote. Then the committee turned their attention to Quinn. Jimmy Quinn sent a letter denying that he had assaulted Alex Craig, claiming the Rangers player had grabbed his legs and all he did was try to free himself. Also included in Quinn's submission was a letter from Craig himself, denying that Quinn had either kicked or stamped on him. The Dundee Courier of the 30th of March 1905 reported the chairman then moved that in light of both letters, the case should be deferred until the next meeting, at which the players could be interviewed in person. A Mr. Williamson then moved that the issue must be considered at once, saying that there was a danger of players becoming the judges and not the referees. He went on that he was opposed to any and all special pleading, and that if players were allowed to come forward claiming they had not been hurt, no legislation would be possible at all. This was met by applause from the committee, and they then discussed how Quinn should be punished, censure or a ban. Mr. Hutton of Stenhousemuir proposed banning him for a month, while Mr. Steen of Ayr said he had been present at the match, had seen Quinn kick Craig, and he should be banned for the rest of the season. The committee voted by 9-5 in favour of a month's ban. Celtic were exonerated of any blame for the break-in, but it was strongly recommended that they make arrangements for the quick access of mounted police to the trackside in the event of any future recurrence. Fortunately, Quinn did not miss any significant matches as a result of his ban, which ended on the 30th of April, so he was available for the league decider, which took place at Hampden on the 5th of May 1905. You might have expected this to be a monumental occasion, the entire league season decided in a winner-take-all Hampden showdown. Today it would dominate the sporting headlines for weeks beforehand, with tickets like gold dust and the country buzzing with anticipation. But it appears from the newspapers of the time that this was very far from the case, with almost a sense of weariness that there was to be yet another clash between the big two, when really it should all be over and done with for the season. The Glasgow Herald report on the match on the 8th of May 1905 began, "The tie for the league championship, which was decided on New Hampden on Saturday, drew a crowd of about 30,000, which was much in excess of what could have been expected in view of the prolongation of the competition beyond the limits of public interest." When this is compared to the 65,000-strong crowd at the Scottish Cup final between the same sides 12 months before, and the 52,000 who had attended the Glasgow Cup final earlier in the season, it certainly does seem strange that 30,000 was regarded as a respectable total. Third Lanark had won the Scottish Cup, beating Rangers 3-1 in front of 30,000 people after a replay on the 15th of April, but the first match, on the 8th of April, had attracted a crowd of 54,000. It seems plain that even after almost a decade and a half of league football in Scotland, the Scottish Cup continued to be the more prestigious competition, and the attendance for the league decider, less than half of that for the Scottish Cup final of 1904, reflected a certain apathy amongst the footballing public at this late stage of the season. And surprisingly, none of the newspapers made a great deal of the match, which also doubled as a Glasgow league fixture in their Monday editions. It has often been suggested that the referee, Mr. F. Kirkham from Preston, was brought up from England for the occasion due to the trouble at the Scottish Cup semi-final match at Celtic Park in a bid to give the appearance of impartiality in the refereeing. But as we have seen, Mr. Kirkham refereed Celtic's league defeat at Dens Park in January, so there was nothing out of the ordinary about his being asked to officiate the play-off. Fred Kirkham was considered one of the top referees in Britain and would take charge of the FA Cup final a year later. Curiously, a week after refereeing a Southern League match between Tottenham Hotspur and Watford, he was appointed manager of Spurs in 1907, although it was not a successful appointment. He was said to be unpopular with the players and fans alike, and resigned 12 months later after 52 games in charge with a record of 25 wins, 8 draws and 19 defeats. He returned to refereeing and as late as March 1913 officiated at an international match between Belgium and Netherlands. Celtic were missing Donny McLeod and Jim Young through injury and lined up Adams, Watson, Orr, McNair, Loney, Hay, Bennett, McMenemy, Quinn, Summers, Hamilton. A tense first half, with Celtic having the advantage of the breeze despite losing the toss, ended goalless. Celtic did most of the attacking, and Sinclair in the Rangers goal was the busier of the two goalkeepers, but Rangers came closest to scoring through R.S. McCall, with Davy Adams tipping his long-range effort over the bar. The Glasgow Herald of the 8th of May 1905 reported that Rangers were happiest at half-time. Play in the first half showed the Rangers a cleverer combination than their opponents, their method of keeping the ball low against a strong wind being superior to the less accurate high kicking of their opponents, and when they retired at the interval with the scores unopened, their chances looked quite rosy. But rather than the expected Rangers onslaught as the wind strengthened at the beginning of the second half, Celtic stepped up the pressure, the Glasgow Herald continuing. However, the second half saw matters reversed, for they abandoned their fine open game for the less profitable one of close passing, and this proved their undoing, for the Celts halves were able to checkmate their every move and kept them out of shooting range. McNair, Loney and Hay were now exerting an iron grip on the midfield, and their passing was creating more openings for the forwards. The game was settled in a 6-minute period just after the hour mark, with Celtic scoring twice in as many minutes, with what the Glasgow Herald described as goals which with ordinary care could have been saved. From the report in the Scottish Referee of the 8th of May 1905, it seems as though Rangers' John May needlessly stopped the ball from going behind and somehow teed it up for Jimmy McMenemy. The Celts were the lucky lot when May kept the ball from going past and allowed McMenemy to beat Sinclair from a difficult angle. Just over a minute later, Celtic were 2 ahead, this time due to a goalkeeping error. The Scotsman reported on the 8th of May 1905, "The cheering and excitement which greeted this success was only equalled by that which followed a couple of minutes later, when, following a corner, Sinclair was beaten for the second time by a deceptive shot from Hamilton from the vicinity of the corner flag, the keeper striking the ball against the inside of the post." 3 minutes later the scoring was completed when John Robertson converted a cross from R.S. McCall past Adams from close range. The scoring was over, but there were still over 20 tension-filled minutes to go, and with Rangers pressing hard, the Celtic halfbacks, ably assisted by Orr and Watson, held firm. The Scottish referee writing on the 8th of May 1905. Thereafter, the Ibrox men had the best of the exchanges and seemed likely to equalise, but the Parkhead middle line was excellent and prevented further disaster. Towards the finish, Gourlay and Quinn came forcibly together, with the result that the Rangers' right half had to be assisted from the field, limping badly. This tone of the Scottish referee report contrasts somewhat with the Glasgow Herald report on the same day, which wrote that, following Celtic's goals, Rangers were seldom dangerous unless when Robertson got their only goal. The Scotsman report gives the impression of Celtic seeing out the game in a professional manner, although Davy Hamilton was cautioned by the referee for deliberately kicking the ball out of the field. The final whistle was greeted with wild cheering from the Celtic fans, and Davy Hamilton, the Scottish referee, reported, secured the ball. This ball-catching epidemic is being pushed to the point of absurdity. It was a remarkable title triumph for Celtic, who had seemed out of the running before their superb win at Ibrox. The Glasgow Herald concluded their report on the 8th of May 1905. Celtic thoroughly deserved the championship, if for nothing else than their plucky uphill fight in the fag end of the season, a season which has been remarkable for the vacillating promises of Airdrieonians, Partick Thistle and Rangers for leading position. It hadn't been a vintage performance to clinch the title, certainly nowhere near as impressive as the Scottish Cup win 12 months before, but maybe that was the point. Celtic, after 7 long years, had regained the ability to grind out wins where they had, for long, dropped points and seen championships slip away due to inconsistency. 3 weeks later, they set the seal on a hugely successful season when the Hampden scorers, McMenemy and Hamilton, repeated the trick in the Charity Cup final in a 2-0 win over Partick Thistle. This was now a season to rival the Triple Cup triumph of 1892, with a treble of League, Glasgow Cup and Glasgow Charity Cup. Before long, they would surpass even that achievement. As much as Willie Maley's young Celts had come of age over the previous 2 seasons, there was as yet little to suggest that they would go on to dominate Scottish football so thoroughly for the rest of the decade. It had required a play-off to take the title from Rangers on the last day of the season, and in truth, there had not been much between the teams at Hampden. Celtic had thrashed their rivals at Ibrox a few weeks before, but over the season, Rangers had had a far superior goal difference and goal average and had knocked Celtic out of the Scottish Cup. In its preview of the new season on the 4th of August 1905, the Scottish referee reported on the great confidence at Ibrox in the summer of 1905. It is confidently anticipated that the coming season will be one of the brightest in the history of the Light Blues. After reporting that the club was finally embarking on the process of replacing the wooden terracing at Ibrox with solid earth constructions 3.5 years after the disaster of 1902, this may have been because only now were Rangers the owners of the land the stadium was built on, the paper wrote, "Everything that experience and forethought can suggest has been done to make the Rangers field and team second to none, and it is believed in official quarters that the team will have a great season." Celtic were likewise confident that the season would be for them a successful one. But the Scottish referee's preview also forecast a diminishing role for Willie Orr, now 32 years old and well into the veteran stage of his career, despite his impressive conversion to fullback. Capped 3 times for Scotland, his last international appearance was against Wales in 1904. But while predicting he would be a backup for season 1905-06, the paper still wrote, "Last year, the back division gave some anxiety through Watson being unable to resume after having his leg broken at Airdrie. The versatility of W. Orr saved the situation, and it is questionable if there was a better left-back in Scotland." The very successful full-back partnership of Donny McLeod and Willie Orr was expected to be broken up that season after the arrival of a signing from Queen's Park, dubbed the catch of the season, in the person of Robert Campbell. The paper continued, "McLeod, if he shows last year's form, will certainly have first call for left-back, and for the right position it will probably be found that the newcomer, R.G. Campbell, late Queen's Park, and correctly considered the catch of the season, will be in high favour." In securing this player, the Celts brought off a big coup, and if the ex-amateur develops as he last season gave every promise of doing, he will be in the running for international honours. Then there is Watson and Orr to be considered. The latter may be none too anxious to play regularly and may content himself by keeping in form to be at call for left half or left back when required. Watson, however, now being fully recovered, may wish to bring himself into prominence once again, and he is capable of doing so. At half, the old trio, Young, Loney and Hay, will again be in evidence, and all's well when they are all right. When any one of them is unfit, Orr can take up the position without weakening the line. In the event, Robert Campbell did not make the impact expected of him, and he was actually transferred to Rangers for £350 in January 1906, after only 7 months at the club. He would play for the Ibrox club for the next 8 years, and after his retirement became a Rangers director in 1926, serving on their board until his death in 1942. The new season kicked off on the 19th of August 1905 against Motherwell at Celtic Park, and as predicted in the Scottish referee, Campbell and McLeod were the fullbacks selected for the opener. But Campbell did not make a brilliant impression, the Celtic wiki entry for the match recording that one newspaper described him as nervous as a bride at the altar. The Glasgow Herald of the 21st of August 1905 wrote, R.G. Campbell shaped rather nervously and was overshadowed by McLeod, who was easily the best back on the field. Former Celt Robert Findlay opened the scoring early for Motherwell, but Alec Bennett equalised minutes later, and 2 goals from Jimmy Quinn completed the scoring before half-time in a 3-1 win for Celtic. It hadn't been a vintage display though, with the Edinburgh Evening News writing on the 21st of August 1905, "It will be interesting to note how Celtic fare in a more serious test, as their display on Saturday leaves something to be desired." Some questions were answered the following week, when a potentially tricky tie at Rugby Park was negotiated in some style, despite early setbacks. Kilmarnock had run Rangers very close in a 3-2 defeat at Ibrox in their opening match, and even though Peter Summers put Celtic ahead in the first minute, Kilmarnock scored twice to take a 2-1 lead after only 12 minutes. Jimmy Hay and Jimmy McMenemy then struck back for Celtic, who led 3-2 at half-time, before David Hamilton added a fourth 10 minutes from the end. Perhaps owing to his nervous performance the week before, Willie Orr was restored to the side in place of Robert Campbell, and far from being a backup at this late stage in his career, Orr was to remain a mainstay of the side, with McLeod and Campbell vying for the right-back slot until the new year. 7 of the first 8 league matches were won, with 1 draw against Hearts at Tynecastle on the 11th of September 1905. Hearts were top of the table, having played a game more than Celtic, and the meeting was eagerly anticipated, with a 12,000-strong crowd packing into the ground. The Scotsman reported on the 12th of September that the crowd was positively shaking with excitement for the full 90 minutes. Rangers had won 4 championships in a row from 1899, but for most of the 1890s it had been Hearts, not Rangers, who had been Celtic's main challengers for the league title, and the series of matches between them was dead level, with the Scottish referee report of the 15th of September describing the match as Greek meeting Greek, meaning a meeting of equals. The paper reported, "Not for many a day has such a sustained and resolute display on the part of 2 teams been witnessed in Edinburgh. Both sides were triers for every inch of the journey, and after 90 minutes hard and fast work, honours were even, the result being a draw, 1 goal each. It was no wonder that signals of distress were visible here and there towards the finish, for the game was a terribly punishing one, but remarkably free from actual roughness." Celtic took the lead just after half-time, when David Hamilton's cross was allowed to run through by Jimmy Quinn for Alec Bennett to fire home. Hearts redoubled their efforts from there and grabbed an equaliser when the Celtic defence failed to clear a scramble in front of goal, and both Hearts and their fans celebrated wildly, the Scotsman reporting on the 12th of September. "George Wilson tipped the ball along to Walker, who flashed it past the keeper amid the greatest enthusiasm and excitement, some of the other players hugging the internationalist round the neck." As well as over-the-top celebrations, there was another now commonplace occurrence at Tynecastle that day, with the Dundee Evening Telegraph reporting on the 12th of September 1905. There was an innovation at Tynecastle yesterday, the sound of the bookie's voice being heard at different parts of the field. Hitherto, football matches in Scotland have been free from the wiles of such category, and an effort will no doubt be made to ensure a discontinuance of the practice initiated yesterday. The match left Hearts still at the top of the table with 4 wins and a draw from their first 5 matches, while Celtic were 2 points behind in third, with 3 wins and a draw from 4 matches. Close on Hearts' heels were the previous season's surprise contenders Airdrieonians, continuing their impressive form from the previous season with a 100% record from 4 games. The biggest crowd of the season so far came to Celtic Park on the 30th of September 1905 for the visit of Airdrie, and the atmosphere seems to have reflected the impressive recent exploits of the Broomfield club, the Scottish referee writing on the 2nd of October 1905. Quite 35,000 must have been on the ground, and the picture presented to the eye was one which will never be forgotten. For exciting passages, the match has seldom been surpassed. With the exception of an international, we have never seen a crowd so wrought up as the one at Parkhead, especially in the closing minutes. Practically every kick and attempt to kick was cheered to the echo, and it was a welcome relief when full time arrived. With Peter Summers injured, and, according to the Glasgow Observer, taking in the match from the balcony of the Pavilion like Priam on the walls of Troy, Jimmy Quinn replaced him at inside left, while Alec Bennett took over at centre forward, and Alec Mcnair was drafted in at outside right. Willie Orr opened the scoring from the penalty spot in 30 minutes, but 5 minutes later, Airdrie were level through their outside left, Hunter. The turning point of the match was the retiral of their right half Ferguson after a challenge by Jimmy Quinn, described by the Scottish referee as uncalled for. Taking full advantage of the extra man, Celtic began peppering the Airdrie goal, and Jimmy McMenemy's 75th minute strike was enough to seal the win. A paragraph in the Scottish referee suggests captains had much more input into tactics than is the case today, crediting Willie Orr for a reshuffle that helped swing the game in Celtic's favour. Until 20 minutes from time, the Celts' front rank was never really settled, but after Captain Orr had rung the changes in his attack and transposed Bennett and McNair with Quinn in centre, the home men played all round their opponents. But for the brilliant and knowing work of Rombach, the margin would have been much wider. Also in the Scottish referee that day was the first inkling of a move across the river for Robert Campbell, hinting at the unexpectedness of the player's decision to join Celtic in the first place, and possibly a wish on the part of Celtic to bolster the ranks of a floundering Rangers team who had recently been beaten 5-0 by Hearts. Negotiations are, we understand, pending between Celtic and Rangers Directorate as to the transfer of R.G. Campbell to the Ibrox Brigade. Some time ago, even in the Celts' interest, we suggested the advisability of this transfer taking place, and certainly, so far as Rangers' requirements at present are concerned, R.G. Campbell would make a great improvement in their defence. It will be remembered that it was his original intention to play for the Rangers, and if that is in his mind still, then it might be profitable for Celtic to part with him, and that too on terms not too harsh, seeing they would profit by the better drawing power of Rangers with Campbell in the team. Whether related to these negotiations or not, Campbell returned to the line-up the following week for only his 4th appearance in the Glasgow Cup final against Third Lanark. A relentless downpour kept the attendance to a disappointing 20,000, but those hardy souls who turned up were treated to a convincing Celtic win. Jimmy Quinn opened the scoring with a typical storming run and shot described in the Glasgow Herald on the 9th of October 1905. Quinn received a timely pass after some good play on both sides, and holding off both backs, drove for goal with such force that the ball rebounded into the field of play from the back of the net. Peter Summers marked his return from injury with a second shortly after, as described in the Scottish referee of the 9th of October. How he got the sole of his boot on the ball after a hard forward pass was marvellous, but the rest was easy, and the ball flashed past Rayside at lightning speed. Adams in goal had very little to do, and the scoring was wrapped up by Jimmy McMenemy with 25 minutes to go to secure the first silverware of the season. With the traditional post-final reception now apparently discontinued by the Glasgow FA, the cup was collected by Chairman John McLaughlin immediately after the match. The Scottish referee report describes how a pitch invader was dealt with in a way very differently than would be the case today. One mirth-provoking interlude was the forcible ejection from the arena of an over-enthusiastic individual by a couple of constables. The final heave over the barrier and among the crowd was enough to keep the hottest brain on ice for a long time to come. Those early 20th century days are not so very far removed from our own times, but another reminder of how close they were to a bygone age was provided by the Glasgow Herald on the same page as their report into the Glasgow Cup final of an almost comedic scene at a local council meeting in England, headlined "Earl's Challenge to a Duel, Lord Kimberley Creates a Scene." A remarkable scene occurred on Saturday at a meeting of the Norfolk County Council at Norwich. During a discussion on the proposed extension of the Shire Hall buildings, the Earl of Kimberley accused Mr Sopwell, a fellow member, of raising objections which he had never mentioned in committee. He challenged Mr Sopwell to fight, saying, "Mr Sopwell and I can leave by the 2:30 train and be in Paris by the morning and fight it out under proper conditions. If I do get about him, God help him." At the close of the meeting, Earl Kimberley repeated his challenges. Mr Sopwell said he would prefer an empty room at the Shire Hall to Paris, with the chairman, Mr Fulks, as umpire. Earl Kimberley said the fight must take place abroad, adding, "If you refuse, you are a coward and a cur." Several members of the council here intervened, and the incident ended. Lord Kimberley was only 21 at the time, and the following year was elected as the Liberal Member of Parliament for Mid-Norfolk, being the youngest MP in the Commons. He was a distant cousin of P.G. Woodhouse, and according to Brewster's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable, was the inspiration for Woodhouse's famous character, Bertie Wooster. Robert Campbell retained his place in the side more often than not up until the turn of the year, playing alongside Willie Orr, who, far from being used as an occasional backup, remained an influential presence in defence. The Glasgow Cup final was followed up by a 5-1 win over Queen's Park, with Jimmy Quinn netting a hat-trick, before the first league defeat of the season, going down 3-2 to Rangers at Ibrox. The match is notable for Willie Orr's penalty kick goal, it being the first penalty kick Celtic had ever been awarded in a league match at Ibrox after 14 years of the competition. The result left Celtic 5 points behind Hearts, now the only team still unbeaten, but with 2 games in hand. Airdrie were back in second place, 1 point ahead of Celtic, though having played a game more. Rangers came back into contention, sitting 2 points further back in fourth place. Rangers' win, courtesy of a goal in the last seconds, was noted as the major surprise of the day, with Celtic having been clear favourites going into the match. The Scottish referee reporting Rangers' most ardent followers would have been delighted with a draw. This may account for the relatively low 30,000 attendance, with the majority of the crowd said to be favouring Celtic. The following week, Willie Orr scored from the spot again in a 3-1 win over Dundee, with the flags at Celtic Park flying at half-mast and the players wearing black armbands as a mark of respect for Joe Cullen, who had died of pneumonia during the week at the age of just 35. Cullen was the first goalkeeper to really make the position his own at Celtic before being displaced by the great Dan MacArthur, and had kept goal for the treble-winning team of 1891-92, the first Celtic side to win the Scottish Cup. The Scottish referee published a brief obituary on the 30th of October 1905, noting that Cullen was the third member of that team to pass away. By the death of Mr Joseph Cullen, the Celtic FC lose another of their old brigade men who in season 1891-2 won the 3 great national cups, to wit the Glasgow, Scottish and the Glasgow Charity, they being the first club to do so in Scotland. Mr Cullen was goalkeeper in that brilliant 11 and had no mean share in securing the triple honour. Some idea of the ability of the 11 may be judged from the scores which they put on in the finals. Thus Clyde and the Glasgow were beaten 7-1, Queen's Park and the Scottish 5-1, and Rangers and the Glasgow Charity 2-0. The names of the team were as follow: goal J. Cullen, backs J. Reynolds and D. Doyle, halfbacks W. Maley, J. Kelly, P. Gallacher, forwards N. McCallum, A. Brady, P. Dowds, A. McMahon, J. Campbell. It will be noted that Mr. Cullen is the third of the team who has reached life's goal, and naturally his old comrades are touched by his death, which lessens their number. The deceased was genial and lovable. The other members of the team who had since passed away were Paddy Gallacher and Peter Dowds. Apart from a surprise 1-0 defeat at home to Port Glasgow Athletic on the 11th of November, avenged by the same scoreline at their Clune Park ground in the return fixture a couple of weeks later, Celtic won every other league match up to the turn of the year, finishing 1905 with a 1-0 win over Hibernian at Easter Road. Their brilliant run of results had now established them firmly at the top of the league, 1 point ahead of early pace-setters Hearts, having played 2 games fewer than the Tynecastle side. Rangers were now in third, 8 points behind Celtic, while Airdrieonians had fallen back into the chasing pack in 6th place. Despite the 2 losses to Rangers and Port Glasgow Athletic, Celtic were setting a standard of consistency that no one else in the league could match. Jimmy Quinn won a small victory of his own that autumn, suing the Glasgow News over a paragraph in their match report on his ordering off against Rangers in March that read, "10 minutes to go and Celts were pressing. Craig saved and fell, and when on the ground, he was savagely kicked on the face by Quinn. This sort of thing could not, of course, be tolerated, and Quinn was instantly ordered to the Pavilion, a penalty he richly deserved. A more brutal and uncalled for action than that of Quinn's has not been seen, we are glad to say, on the football field for many a long day." In the absence of film footage of the match, we'll probably never know exactly what happened between Quinn and Craig 10 minutes from time that day. Wildly conflicting evidence was heard in the 2-day court case, where Quinn initially sued for £500 damages, but on the morning of the opening day, Joseph Shaughnessy, representing Quinn, withdrew the damages claim, asking merely for a solatium for injury to his feelings. From the court proceedings, it seems Quinn merely sought an apology and an admission that the paper's description of what happened was untrue. Both the Dundee Evening Telegraph and the Edinburgh Evening News carried reports on the hearing at Glasgow Sheriff Court over the 2 days of the trial on the 1st and 2nd November. But as ever, the most detailed account of proceedings was carried in the Scottish Referee on Friday the 3rd of November 1905. On the first day, Alex Craig gave evidence for Quinn, in which he confirmed that he had been neither kicked nor stamped on by the Celtic forward. Curiously, the letter submitted in his name to the SFA disciplinary hearing had actually been written by Willie Maley, who visited him at home and asked him to sign it. His signature was also witnessed by the player's mother. The letter was produced in court and read, "I hereby certify that on Saturday last, when J. Quinn was ordered off the field by referee Robertson, he neither kicked nor stamped upon me, but I held his legs for my own protection, being underneath, and he simply struggled to free his legs, which I held." It emerged in questioning that the phrase, "for my own protection," had not appeared in Maley's original letter, and had been inserted at Craig's insistence. John McLaughlin, Willie Maley, Willie Orr, Jimmy McMenemy and Alec Bennett all appeared for Quinn, denying that he had kicked or stamped on Craig. Both A.B. Mackenzie, the Rangers linesman at the match, and James Stark, the Rangers centre-half, testified that they had not seen Quinn kick Craig. Stark testified that Quinn had played a fair enough game on the day. Next, the match referee Tom Robertson appeared for the defence. He claimed that Quinn had stamped on Craig, and apart from the inaccuracy about kicking him on the face, the report had been a fair account of the incident. He was backed by evidence from Thomas Steen of Ayr, a member of the International Selection Committee, who said the report in the Glasgow News was very fair, and that he had moved Quinn be suspended for the rest of the season. The referee's account was also corroborated by former Queen's Park player John Gillespie, who had once played as a guest for Celtic in the International League Championship match against Aston Villa in 1895. Gillespie said that Quinn stamped on Craig and that it was the most disgraceful thing I ever saw on the football field. Rangers' John May, who had been injured in a collision with Quinn earlier in the match and had to leave the field temporarily for treatment, testified that Quinn had then told him he deserved twice as much. When the Defence Counsel, Mr Cook, asked what inference he had drawn from that, the Sheriff interjected, "Allow us to draw our own inference." The case came down to the accuracy of the report, with Mr Cook claiming the defence of Veritas, which he claimed did not require the report to be truthful in every single respect. It had been established that Quinn did not kick Craig in the face, but if he had assaulted Craig by stamping on him, the report would still be truthful, and Quinn's reputation would not be restored by the distinction. The second day's proceedings ended with an interesting exchange between the Sheriff and Joseph Shaughnessy, as reported in the Scottish Referee on the 3rd of November 1905. His Lordship asked, merely, he pointed out, for the purpose of argument, that, supposing he were of opinion that something of the nature of assault had been proved, but that the assault as described was a misdescription, what would your position be? Mr Shaughnessy: My position then would be this, that I had contributed to a considerable extent to the publication of this slander by my conduct on that particular day, and that in these circumstances I would only be entitled to nominal damages, say a farthing, and expenses. His Lordship: You would think so yourself? Mr Shaughnessy: Yes, from the very beginning I did not want a penny, but I think I am entitled to point out for your Lordship's consideration that I was justified in raising the action. The Sheriff reserved judgment until the 16th of November, when he pronounced that Quinn was due the sum of 1 shilling in damages, but that neither side was entitled to expenses. He ruled that while Quinn had not kicked Craig in the face, he had stamped on him, and the Glasgow News had accused him of too grave an offence. The Sheriff also touched on the subject of press privilege, which had been invoked by the Glasgow News, that they were entitled to criticise players having been invited to the match by the home club. The Glasgow Herald quoted the Sheriff on the 17th of November 1905. The plea of privilege must first be disposed of. If a newspaper narrates the fact that a player was ordered off the field for rough play or unfair play, and that proves to be the case, the player has no grounds for complaint, even if he should show that the referee was mistaken. But no such case is presented here. The defender's newspaper stated, as a matter of fact, that the pursuer had behaved in the manner before described and commented upon it in the most unfavourable terms. The fact that the referee ordered the pursuer to leave the field affords them no protection in making statements such as those if they are proved to be false. Nor is it of avail to the defenders to say that they were publishing their report simply in the public interest. The defenders plead privilege, however, on the further ground that as the football match was of the nature of a public spectacle to which their reporters are invited by the provision of free seats for their acceptance, criticism is directly invited by the proprietors of the ground and tacitly also by the players. I do not think there is anything in the argument, which was made a good deal of at the debate, that a reporter who has been given a free seat is more privileged than a spectator who has paid at the gate. If there were any distinction, I should think it would be of the converse character, on the principle that a man who has paid for his dinner is more free to criticise the cooking than a guest. There is no doubt that people who take part in any performance to which the public are invited are liable to criticism and cannot complain of it, but only in their characters as performers. Thus, it is permissible for a newspaper to criticise theatrical performers in a very hostile manner, to say that an actor has mistaken his vocation, that he is comic in tragedy or pathetic in burlesque. But if the critic says that the actor appeared on the stage the worse for drink, that is no longer a criticism of his acting, it is a criticism of his conduct affecting his character, and there is no privilege. In criticising a football player similarly, a reporter may say that he is incompetent or even rough in his play, and the player cannot be allowed to prove that these statements are false. But if the reporter says that he deliberately kicked another player on the face, that is not a criticism of his play at all, but of his conduct in a matter which affects his character, and there is no privilege. The judgment essentially said Quinn had assaulted Craig and the paper had merely gotten the details wrong. The Scottish referee quoted Sheriff Davidson on the 17th of November 1905. "The pursuer has set out from the first to show that the whole story of his misdeeds is founded on error, and he has failed. On the other hand, the defenders have put themselves in the wrong too. After they were asked to withdraw and apologise for what they had said, it must have been easy for them to discover that their reporter's account was exaggerated and to withdraw so much as could not be substantiated. If they had consulted their other reporter who was present and the referee, they could have satisfied themselves of the fact that they made too grave a charge. But they stuck to their report, and therefore I do not think they ought to have any expenses awarded to them." The sheriff awarded Quinn a shilling in damages, but ruled neither party were due expenses. It's entirely plausible that Jimmy Quinn did not stamp on Alex Craig. It's also entirely possible that he did. The sheriff discounted Craig's testimony on the grounds that footballers were likely to protect each other from the consequences of their actions, and asserted that Tom Robertson's evidence had been most convincing. So, in a Pyrrhic victory, Quinn was declared to have not kicked Craig in the face, but the sheriff made it clear that he regarded the Glasgow News report as essentially true, albeit they had been wrong to say Craig was kicked in the face. Back on the pitch, the new year opened with a 1-0 victory over Rangers at Celtic Park in a match that turned on two incidents a matter of seconds apart. Celtic pressed hard for most of the match, but the Rangers' defence was in great form and chances were kept to a minimum. After 70 minutes, Rangers claimed a goal when Smith shot past Adams, but the ball rebounded back into play, whether off the post or the back of the net is unclear. But the referee did not signal a goal while the Rangers players claimed it had gone in. The Glasgow Herald of the 2nd of January 1906 described what happened next. "A grand shot by A. Smith seemed to have bounded back from the net into play, but the referee disallowed the point, and in the next minute, Hamilton had sprinted off on the left, and, beating Gray and Walker on the way, he drove hard at Sinclair, who partially cleared, but ere he could recover, the ball was past him." Celtic survived a late scare when Rangers claimed a penalty for a trip on the edge of the penalty box, but after consulting a linesman, the referee awarded a free kick just outside, and the points were safe. The following day, 2 goals by Jimmy Quinn and Alec Bennett in the last 10 minutes gave Celtic a deserved victory over Kilmarnock at Celtic Park after the Kelly goal had been besieged for most of the match without success. The Scottish referee wrote on the 5th of January 1906, "Kilmarnock put in one of the dourest defences seen this season in the league. Starting with the wind behind them, Celtic soon got among the Kilmarnock's backs and the shots began to rain on Monteith. This custodian seemed able to take all and sundry balls that came his way, and some of his saves bordered on the wonderful." The New Year fixtures left Celtic 3 points ahead of Hearts, who had played 2 games more, and the Scottish referee had practically awarded the title to Celtic, writing after the win over Kilmarnock. "With this win, Celtic have now established a lead which is almost unassailable, and unless a falling off in form takes place, which is not likely to happen, the competition will eventuate in Celtic winning the championship hands down." The forecast was correct. There was no falling off in form, although there were minor stutters, with 1-0 defeats to Dundee at Dens Park and Aberdeen in Celtic's first ever visit to Pittodrie. Celtic were without Donny McLeod, Alec Mcnair and Jimmy Quinn for the match at Pittodrie, all on duty for Scotland against Wales at Tynecastle. Unfortunately, the loss at Dens Park was followed by defeat in the quarter-finals of the Scottish Cup at home to Hearts on the 24th of February 1906. Celtic had taken the lead on 30 minutes through Jimmy McMenemy, but the 50,000 crowd was left bitterly disappointed after an impressive Hearts side equalised early in the second half, then scored a 75th minute winner. 2 weeks later, Port Glasgow Athletic knocked out Rangers with a 1-0 win at Clune Park, and Hearts would go on to beat third Lanark in the final. On the same day, Rangers crashed out of the Cup in Port Glasgow. After Athletic turned down an offer of £500 to switch the tie to Ibrox, Celtic clinched a league title with a 6-0 win over Queen's Park at Hampden. With Queen's Park anchored to the foot of the table and their glory days firmly behind them, A crowd of only between 10 to 13,000 was present at Hampden to see Celtic secure their 6th league title. Celtic didn't hang around, scoring 3 times in the opening stages, the Scottish referee reporting there were Queen's Park players who hadn't touched the ball until after Celtic scored their 2nd. The Glasgow Herald recorded on the 12th of March 1906. From the start, the Celts took the game in hand and Quinn early registered the first goal. Brilliant forward play characterised the game of the Celts, and Hamilton, close in, put on the 2nd goal, which was shortly afterwards followed by another from Quinn, who played marvellously clever football. Second half goals from McMenemy, Bennett and another from Quinn to complete his hat-trick finished the scoring before he left the field injured. An advert appeared in the Scottish Referee of the 12th of March 1906 that read, "Celtic v Rangers on a phonograph record. Very loud. Band plays. Crowd cheers. Match proceeds. So realistic you can almost see it. 1 shilling. Postage 3d. Brown, 154 Gorgie Road, Edinburgh." An early 20th century version of a DVD release of a match, perhaps. I wonder if any of these records survive. Celtic had won the league in convincing fashion, and they extended their lead over second-placed Hearts, as well as exacting a measure of revenge for the Scottish Cup exit when they defeated the Tynecastle club on the 21st of April in the middle of a storm, which probably accounts for the paltry 5,000 attendance, and which actually stopped play for a spell in the first half. The Glasgow Herald wrote on the 23rd of April 1906, "The Celtic were lucky to win the toss for choice of ends and played with a strong wind and rain behind them. With this advantage, the Celtic forwards fairly besieged the Hearts goal and Bennett and Hamilton had good tries to effect a score. Several corners were raised but were of no use in bringing about the desired result. When the game had gone about 25 minutes, a regular storm of wind and rain drove the players to the shelter of the Pavilion. The game was resumed within 5 minutes, however. Before half-time, Hearts had a player sent off for a foul on the dangerous Hamilton, and even against the wind, Celtic continued to dominate, finally making the breakthrough with Jimmy Quinn's 22nd league goal of the season, as the Glasgow Herald described. After McNair had brought out Phillips' saving qualities with a splendid ground shot from 20 yards out, Quinn got possession and scored with a rocket shot, which passed in low at the corner of the post. Celtic finished on 49 points, 6 ahead of Hearts, with the Adrionians in third, and Rangers a distant fourth, 12 points behind the champions. Port Glasgow Athletic, winners at Celtic Park and conquerors of Rangers in the Scottish Cup, could have been relegated along with Queen's Park had the top division not been expanded to 18 teams for season 1906-07, while Division 2 champions Leith Athletic were denied promotion. Second-placed Clyde and fourth-placed Hamilton Academical being the 2 teams admitted to the top flight. The expansion of the league, which now entailed a season of 34 games rather than the 18 for most of its history so far, makes Celtic's success of 1906-07 all the more impressive. After a 5-3 defeat to Rangers in the semi-final of the Glasgow Charity Cup and a 1-0 loss at home to Third Lanark in the final league match, the club embarked on another tour of Central Europe, playing matches against German, Bohemian and Hungarian teams. Most of the matches were one-sided affairs, notably a 9-1 win over VfB Leipzig, a 7-0 victory over Wiener Ramblers and an 8-1 win over MTK Budapest. There was also a 2-2 draw with Newcastle United and a 1-0 win over Southampton, both also touring the region. The only continental side who managed to match Celtic was Slavia Prague, now managed by former Celtic hero Johnny Madden, who fought out a 3-3 draw on the 29th of May 1906. Very good quality photographs of this match can be seen on the Celtic Wiki website. By the summer of 1906, Celtic had a team as exciting as any in their history so far. To this point, the 1891-92 team, with their Scottish, Glasgow and Charity Cup treble, had been the benchmark. With this season's failure to capture the Scottish Cup, they probably just about still held that distinction. But they were about to be surpassed. Next time, we'll cover the story of the first League and Scottish Cup double in Scottish football, as Willie Orr's Celtic story reaches a memorable finale, and along the way we'll have a closer look at the legends who, alongside their captain, made history.